What is going on, everyone? My name is Andy. Welcome back to another FPL video. In this one, we're going to discuss the best cheap forwards and whether or not they deserve a place in our FPL teams for game week 1. We've already done cheap defenders and cheap midfielders, so time to tick off the forwards. Then we'll move on to the higher price brackets and look at those as well. For this particular video, I've set the price cap at 6.5 million or below, so we're not discussing anyone above that. If you do find this video useful, make sure to give it a like, hit that subscribe button if you're new around here. Let's jump into it. So just a few notes before we get started. There isn't really a standout forward from what I can see. Either they're not completely nailed or they don't have a great run of fixtures. Like, one of the reasons we talked about Neto and Wolves, for example, is because they at least have really good targetable fixtures in the opening 6. For most of the players on this list, that's just not the case. Even if they do, it's for a very small amount of time, much less than 6 game weeks, right? So that's one concern with them. If in doubt, and if you do want a cheap forward, it might just be worth picking up one of the penalty takers. One good thing about some of the players on this list, they are the penalty takers for their clubs and often the talisman as well, which is pretty good. So if they're going to score, it is going to go through some of these players, and we'll discuss that as we go. One strategy for at least early season before the fixtures change could be to rotate with a cheap defender or a cheap midfielder. So I've discussed that in other videos, that when you're forward, whoever it is, you know, whether it's Brennan Johnson, Mitrovic, Solanke or whoever, when they've got a tougher fixture, you could play your cheap defender or cheap midfielder instead and rotate your squad a little bit. That would also give you a good bench option as well. And once again, like, it is pretty difficult to just completely overlook the fact that a lot of these players, 5.5 to 6.5, there are better alternatives in the defensive slots. It's not quite as easy as comparing like that, because obviously the value you get in cheap defenders is nothing to be overlooked, but it's something to consider. On the flip side, compared to some of the cheap midfielders, they are at least mostly better for minutes, if not, you know, even though the fixtures aren't quite as good. So that's just a couple of notes. Let's get into the players. So I think if all things were equal in terms of fixtures for the cheap forwards, a lot of us would probably put Mitrovic in our game week 1 side. Unfortunately, they're not all equal and the fixtures are pretty bad. We'll come back onto them in a minute. But in terms of what he did last season, it was a pretty ridiculous record in the Championship. We know he's the talisman for Fulham. We know that a lot of the goals are going to go through him. He is the penalty taker as well. And you can do worse thing than loading up your FPL teams with players like this who do score most of the goals for their team and are going to play 90 minutes most games and have penalties. So there's a lot of pros in terms of going for Mitrovic. He also scored 43 goals in 44 starts last year. That was 1.01 goals per 90 minutes for Mitrovic. Now, some people are going to say he's scored goals in the Championship before, he's come up to the Premier League and not done too well. But last time out it was under Scott Parker. Marco Silva is now managing them. They were extremely good in the Championship last year. The best team, scored a lot of goals as well. There's always that risk that a manager, when they come up to the Premier League trying to keep their team in the league, will revert to type, maybe be a bit more cautious, be a bit more defensive, and therefore it won't be quite as good for Mitrovic. But I do think there's more of a chance of him scoring goals this time around than there was last time, right? So there is potential there, but I cannot overlook those fixtures. In the opening 6, they've got to play Liverpool, Spurs and Arsenal. And in fact, if we look at the slightly longer run of fixtures, in game week 7, they've also got to play Chelsea at home. So first 7 fixtures, they've got to play 4 of last year's top 5. And they've also got Brighton in there, Brentford. Some people looking at Raya, Sanchez in goal because we're hoping for clean sheets. It just doesn't look like a good start for Fulham. I think if there was an early wild card, maybe game week 8 onwards, you got Forest, Newcastle, West Ham, Bournemouth, Villa and Leeds, then potentially we could put him in. I just think, although I've spoken about potentially rotating an attacker, and maybe 0.5 million shouldn't put me off, because I've looked at this with £6 million forwards, for example, but 6.5 just feels like quite a lot to be putting on my bench fairly regularly looking at the fixtures. So as much as I'd love to have Mitrovic in my team for 6.5, I just cannot overlook those fixtures, and for me he probably won't be in my game week 1 squad. There's quite a few similarities between Solanke and Mitrovic, right? They're both going to start pretty much every game. They're both going to play 90 minutes for most of those games. They're on penalties as well. If their teams score, there's a high likelihood that it goes through these two players. Solanke is a little bit cheaper at 6 million, so you could argue maybe it's a little bit easier to go and rotate him. He didn't score quite as many goals last year, by the way, so I don't think he is as good an option as Mitrovic, but if the fixtures are right, he still could be a decent option. And again, if you're comparing him to like a Reece James or a Chilwell, yeah, maybe you probably go for the defender, but as a 6 million forward forward versus a lot of the cheaper midfielders, there's not too many dead certs there. So at least you're going to get minutes from him and the odd chance of penalties. The problem is the fixtures aren't really that much better than they are for Fulham. So in the opening 4 fixtures, again, if you're talking about rotation, you're possibly going to rotate him for 3 of the first 4. Definitely for Man City and Liverpool away, they're just not great. And then Arsenal at home isn't that much easier either. Okay, then it's Wolves and Nottingham Forest. But if we look at the slightly longer list again, you've got that Brighton and Brentford game in there. We've just said we're targeting goalkeepers for those teams. Newcastle away, Leicester at home. They're okay. There's a lot of green fixtures on this ticker. On the official FPL side, but I'm not sure they're as easy as they look. So unfortunately, again, I just think the fixtures would probably put me off. Even if you could stomach having a £6 million player on your bench, I just think if anything happens in those first 4, you're probably going to look to kind of transfer him out, like if there's another forward that comes along, because you're not just going to want to stick out those difficult fixtures. So on an early wild card, possibly even slightly earlier than Mitrovic, like game week 5 or 6, you'd possibly be looking to put Solanke in for that run of fixtures that aren't all necessarily easy, but they're okay. You know he's going to play, you know he's probably going to score a few goals, and he's on penalties as well. You can probably stomach that. But from game week 1, again, I think he'd probably put me off a little bit. And if I was going to go for one of them, I'd maybe even slightly side with Mitrovic. So Undav intrigues me, right? Maybe more so than any player on this list, because for his price, it's a little bit easier to swallow if you have to rotate him a little bit, right? He's only 5.5 million, and there are definitely some pros and some cons for him, right? First of all, the fixtures are better, so there's probably a little bit less chance of you wanting to rotate him. He also goes into a side that hasn't just come up from the Championship. They are now pretty well established in the Premier League. They don't necessarily score a lot of goals. Maybe he can help with that. That might be one of the marks against him. The big issue is minutes, right? We don't know right now if he is the first choice or going to be part of the first choice 11 for Brighton. Pre-season might give us some indication of that. I've seen some comments on a few videos that I keep talking about pre-season and it's useless because, you know, teams rotate, they play the kids and stuff like that. But I think as you get to the latter stages of pre-season, like the, you know, the final match or the penultimate match, you start to get an idea of who the first choice 11 is. And if there is an indication that Undav is part of that, then for 5.5 million, he could be worth a go because the fixtures are slightly better than we've seen for Fulham and Bournemouth, especially when you get to like game week 4 and 5. And he does have pretty good pedigree. Last year, 25 goals in 33 games, although that was in the Belgian league. So it's not only a new team, of which Solanke and Mitrovic don't suffer from that, it's also a new league as well. And there's also a big worry over whether he will start. And if there's any doubts about that, he's just not going to be one we can go with for game week 1. But if it does look like he's going to start, he could be decent. In terms of penalties, I don't expect him to have them. Plenty of other players at Brighton have taken penalties before, so I don't think he would automatically be given them. But again, we'll have to wait and see. So I think he's got potential to be a really good option for us this year, but we're going to have to see how he adapts. And more importantly, we're going to have to try and find out if he's actually going to start first of all. So I think out of all the promoted sides, if I'm going to pick a striker from one of them, it's probably going to be one of the Nottingham Forest boys, just because of the fixtures. And again, they are not like massively great by any means, but they only play at least 2 of the top 6 in the opening 6 fixtures. They got Bournemouth in there, Newcastle away and Everton away. Again, not necessarily super easy, but they're okay. So that's one of the reasons I'm looking at them. Should score a few goals as well. Minutes should be good for both of these players. They usually play with 2 up front. The interesting thing is about Brennan Johnson, there was a little bit of hype about him before the prices were revealed, but quite a few people were hoping that he'd come in as a midfielder because although he plays in that front 2, he often drifts into some of the wider positions. So it might be the case that Awoniyi is the slightly better option, but again, he is coming new into this team, and in general, Nottingham Forest have changed or are going to have to change quite a few players. So it'll be interesting to see how quickly that team adapts, playing for their new team back in the Premier League, etc., etc. Johnson did score quite a few goals last year, though. 16 goals, 10 assists. From what I could see, he did take about 3 or 4 penalties last year, so you would assume he'd still be penalty taker this year. Again, Nottingham Forest fans, let me know in the comments below if this is completely rubbish, but he should be the penalty taker. But there is a chance that Awoniyi might take him off him, and he is probably more likely to be that central striker. He's not going to be the one that kind of drifts wide. So as long as these two are both starting, they could both be good options. Awoniyi in particular, his goals per 90 last year in the Bundesliga was pretty decent. His expected goals and expected assists are also not bad at all. And I've got to be honest, I didn't know much about him when I saw that he signed, but when I looked those numbers up, I was quite impressed, right? And I do think there is potential there for sure, especially with those fixtures. So if I had to pick one right now, if Johnson's going to be on penalties, I probably still would go with him. But Awoniyi has made it into a few drafts so far in pre-season. Part of it is those fixtures. So again, whether or not they're the best players to start with remains to be seen, because I do think there's quite a few decent options in defence and midfield as well. But in terms of fixtures, I think I'm most likely to go for a Forest player just because of that. Which one of these two, though, it does get difficult. I'd probably have to side with Johnson right now. I just wanted to talk about a few of the other options just so people don't tell me that I've missed them out. I think with Che Adams, look, if he's going to be a regular starter for Southampton, 6.5 million might be okay, but I think I'd be more likely to go for him if he was a little bit cheaper. And again, the fixtures aren't great, especially if Leicester get their act together. Spurs, Leicester, Man United, Chelsea, it's not ideal starting fixtures. With Eduardo Mateta, you don't necessarily know exactly who's going to start week in, week out. Their overall kind of underlying numbers are okay, but the fixtures are awful, right? Arsenal, Liverpool, and Man City again in the opening 4 game weeks, but they do at least have price on their side. They're only 5.5, so at some point they might be options for us. And Iheanacho and Daka, I like both of them if the fixtures are good, but only if Jamie Vardy's injured, because if he isn't, he's probably starting most weeks, especially now Leicester don't have Europe to contend with. So they are both good players, and if they get Premier League moves, which doesn't look very likely, I've not really heard anything about that, they would probably go straight into my side, because I do think they're proper decent, both of them. But until Vardy is injured or suspended or something like that, they're just probably not going to be options. So there we go. That is a quick look at the cheap forwards. Let me know down below if there are any players on this list that you're looking to go for. I do think the choice is a little bit limited just because of either minutes concerns or fixture concerns. But possibly for some of them, Solanke, Mitrovic in particular, maybe one of the Nottingham Forest boys, because they're most likely to play week in, week out, 90 minutes and stuff like that. Maybe they're worth just sticking in and not worrying about it and just using your transfers on other parts of your team instead. Let me know if that's kind of the strategy that you're going for. If you did enjoy it, this quick look, please do give it a like and hit that subscribe button if you are new around here, and I'll catch you again tomorrow for another video.